September 26, 1983. To the billions of people sleeping across the globe, it was a Monday night like any other, a quiet transition into the final months of a year defined by high-tension diplomacy and the looming specter of the evil empire. But for a handful of men buried beneath the earth in a classified bunker outside Moscow, the concept of a quiet night had just been erased from human history. Inside the Serpukhov 1-5 command center, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of ozone, stale coffee, and the sterile hum of heavy-duty cooling fans. The bunker served as the nerve center for the Soviet Union's Oko early warning satellite system. Its purpose was singular and grim: to watch the horizon of the United States and wait for the flashes of light that would signal the end of civilization. The glowing monitors filled with amber text and primitive radar sweeps lit the faces of the duty officers with a sickly fluorescent pallor. Then, without warning, the world inside the bunker shattered. The sirens began. They weren't the low-frequency warbles of a technical glitch. They were the high-pitched, bone-chilling screams of a system that had found exactly what it was built to find. Missile launch detected. Across the main display, a single word flashed in a jarring blood-red hue: launch. According to the satellites orbiting thousands of miles above the American Midwest, a Minuteman Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM, had just roared out of its silo. Then another, then another. Within seconds, the computer identified 5 distinct launches. The trajectory calculations were instantaneous. The targets were Soviet cities. The estimated time to impact, less than 30 minutes. In the Cold War, protocol wasn't a suggestion, it was the law of survival. The Soviet military machine was built on the foundation of launch on warning. If the Americans fired, the Soviets had to fire back before their own silos were turned into craters. There was no room for a committee meeting. There was no time for a diplomatic cable. This was the moment for which every drill, every bunker, and every nuclear warhead had been meticulously prepared. And in that moment, the fate of every living soul on the planet fell onto the shoulders of a single man. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was a man who preferred the company of schematics to the company of politicians. At 44 years old, he was a seasoned officer, but he was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He was not a general who dreamed of battlefield glory, nor was he a fanatic ideologue. Petrov was an engineer, and in the final analysis, that was the most important detail of the night. Petrov's role that evening was purely oversight. He was filling in for another officer, sitting at the center of the command chain as the duty officer. On paper, his instructions were a simple binary flowchart: receive the electronic warning from the satellite array, confirm the validity of the signal through the computer's internal diagnostics, report the confirmed attack to the Soviet General Staff. From there, the red button would be pressed. The General Staff would notify the General Secretary, and within minutes, thousands of Soviet warheads would begin their flight over the North Pole. There would be no debate. The Soviet system was designed to remove human hesitation from the equation. It was a machine built to react with the speed of light and the finality of a guillotine. If Petrov spoke the words "confirmed attack," the machinery of Armageddon would become self-sustaining. No second chances, no wait and see. Within the hour, the Northern Hemisphere would be a graveyard of radioactive ash. But Petrov sat frozen. As the sirens wailed and his subordinates looked to him for the order to relay the alert, the engineer inside him began to itch. He looked at the flashing screens, then at the young, panicked faces of the officers around him. He knew that if he did his job, the job he had been trained for since he was a cadet, the world ended tonight. The data coming from the Oko satellites was terrifyingly specific. It wasn't a vague radar blip or a ghost in the static. The system was showing 5 American ICBMs rising with clinical precision from their silos in the United States. 5. The number echoed in Petrov's mind. He looked at the red launch lights and felt a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. If the United States were going to start World War III, if they were truly going to commit to the final war, they wouldn't start with 5 missiles. Strategic doctrine, both American and Soviet, dictated a massive first strike. To destroy the Soviet Union's ability to retaliate, the U.S. would have to launch hundreds, if not thousands, of missiles simultaneously. They would saturate the sky with warheads to overwhelm the very bunkers like the one Petrov was sitting in. Starting a nuclear war with 5 missiles was like trying to start a forest fire with a single match in a rainstorm. It was a decapitation strike, perhaps, a way to kill the leadership in Moscow, but it would leave the rest of the Soviet military completely intact and ready to turn North America into a wasteland. It made no tactical sense. It made no human sense. But the computer was confident. The early warning system was the pinnacle of Soviet technology. It had been tested, retested, and vetted by the greatest minds in the USSR. The alarms were deafening, a physical pressure against Petrov's eardrums. The screen continued to glow that terrifying, undeniable red. By every letter of the Soviet military code, this was a first strike. Petrov was expected to trust the machine. The machine didn't have hunches. The machine didn't have doubts. The machine had been designed for this exact moment to take the burden of choice away from the man. The officers around Petrov were shouting now, asking for the confirmation. They were conditioned to believe the screen. They were waiting for Petrov to pick up the phone and seal the fate of the world. Petrov's hand hovered over the receiver. He had 2 choices: trust the multi-billion-ruble defense system that was telling him death was on the way, or trust his own gut feeling that something, somehow, wasn't right. He had 23 minutes left. The sirens continued to wail, a rhythmic, mechanical shriek that seemed to vibrate the very metal of the desks. In any other Soviet bunker, the duty officer would have already been shouting into the receiver, his voice cracking with the strain of relaying the apocalypse. But Petrov remained anchored to his seat, his eyes narrowed, scanning the data cascades on his monitor. This is where the secret of the night truly begins. Stanislav Petrov was not just a cog in the military machine. He was a creator of it. Unlike the career officers who merely operated the equipment, Petrov was a senior engineer who had helped oversee the design and implementation of the OKO system software. He knew the lines of code. He knew the limitations of the vacuum tubes and the primitive transistors. More importantly, he knew that the system had been rushed. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was desperate to close the technology gap with the West. The Reagan administration's Star Wars program had sent the Kremlin into a tailspin of insecurity. In their haste to achieve parity, the Soviet High Command had pushed the OKO system into active duty before it had been fully vetted under every possible environmental condition. Petrov's mind, trained for troubleshooting rather than blind obedience, began to deconstruct the attack. First, there was the sheer lack of volume. Nuclear strategy in 1983 was a science of overkill. A first strike was not a surgical procedure, it was a sledgehammer. To prevent a Soviet counter-launch, the Americans would have to hit hundreds of targets simultaneously: command centers, communication hubs, and silo fields across 11 time zones. 5 missiles were a mathematical absurdity. If he followed protocol and reported a strike, he would be starting a global holocaust based on a move that no rational adversary would ever make. Second, there was the lack of corroboration. Petrov knew that the OKO satellites were only the first layer of the shield. The second layer consisted of ground-based over-the-horizon radar stations. If 5 Minuteman missiles were truly screaming across the stratosphere, those radar stations should have been picking up the ionized trails. He checked the internal phone lines to the radar operators. "Anything?" he asked, his voice a low growl against the chaos of the room. "Nothing," came the reply. "The horizon is clear." To Petrov, the scenario looked artificial. It looked like a ghost in the machine. It looked like a digital lie. As the clock ticked toward the 10-minute mark, the point of no return for a retaliatory strike, Petrov's memory reached back into the dense, dry technical briefings he had attended during the system's development. He recalled a specific theoretical vulnerability that the designers had dismissed as a one-in-a-billion fluke. The Oko satellites functioned by detecting the infrared signature of a rocket's exhaust plume against the dark background of space or the cool surface of the Earth. But the system was sensitive, perhaps too sensitive. That night, the Earth, the Sun, and the Oko satellite were in a rare, lethal alignment. It was the autumn equinox. Petrov realized that the satellite was positioned at a specific angle where the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon. He surmised that the sun's rays were hitting the top of high-altitude clouds at a shallow, glancing angle. To a primitive infrared sensor, the intense reflection of sunlight off a bank of ice crystals in the upper atmosphere could look exactly like the white-hot flare of a rocket engine. The machine didn't understand context. It saw a flash of light and matched it to the only thing it was programmed to find: death. It didn't know about the beauty of a sunset or the reflective properties of cirrus clouds. It only knew the logic of war. Petrov did. He understood the nuance of the atmosphere. He understood that the intelligence of the machine was only as good as the men who programmed it, and he knew those men were fallible. He was standing between a billion-dollar mistake and the end of human history. His subordinates were now standing behind him, their hands shaking, their faces white. One of them began to pray, another began to sob. They were waiting for their commander to be a soldier. Petrov, instead, chose to be a scientist. Petrov reached out and picked up the heavy black telephone. This was the direct line to the duty officer at the Soviet General Staff headquarters. The man on the other end was a high-ranking general, a man who lived by the clock and the code. He was waiting for one of two things: a report of all clear or the confirmation that would authorize the launch of the Soviet Union's entire nuclear triad. Petrov's heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he felt it in his throat. Sweat ran down his back, soaking through his uniform. If he was wrong, if those 5 missiles were real, the Soviet Union would be decapitated in minutes. His country would be defenseless, and he would be remembered, if anyone was left to remember, as the greatest traitor in the history of the motherland. He would be the man who let his people die because he had a hunch. He cleared his throat. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the electronic scream of the alarm. He waited 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, he weighed the lives of every person he had ever known against the data on a glowing screen. "This is Petrov," he said, his voice miraculously steady. The general on the other end waited. "I am reporting a system malfunction. The alarm is false. Repeat, the alarm is false." He hung up. Now the most agonizing wait in human history began. For the next 20 minutes, Petrov and his team sat in the flickering light of the bunker. They were waiting to either hear the sound of an all clear or to feel the ground shake as the first American warheads hit Moscow. If he was right, the world would go on unaware of how close it had come to the brink. If he was wrong, he would likely be dead before he could even realize his mistake. He watched the countdown clock. 15 minutes to impact, 10 minutes, 5. The technicians stared at the radar screens. The missiles on the satellite display were still there, moving toward the Soviet heartland, but the ground-based radar remained silent. No new missiles appeared. No secondary launches were detected. The clock hit 0. Nothing happened. The silence that followed was more deafening than the sirens had ever been. There were no flashes of light, no shock waves, no sirens from the city above. The air in the bunker remained stale. The world outside remained asleep. The missiles had been nothing more than the sun glinting off the clouds over North Dakota, a technical fluke that nearly triggered a global extinction. For decades following that harrowing night in the Serpukhov 15 bunker, Stanislav Petrov remained a man of few words. When the story finally began to leak out of the crumbling Soviet archives in the late 1990s, journalists and historians flocked to his modest apartment on the outskirts of Moscow. They wanted a story of cinematic bravado. They wanted to hear that he felt like a hero or that he had a divine vision of peace. But Petrov downplayed his decision with a weary, almost clinical humility. He would shrug his shoulders, light a cigarette, and tell them it was merely intuition. He called it a guess. He called it luck. However, as his former colleagues and the engineers who worked alongside him began to speak, a deeper, more profound reason emerged, one that struck at the heart of the relationship between man and machine. Petrov did not trust perfection. On that night, the OKO system hadn't just reported a potential threat, it had reported a highest probability attack. The computer was operating with absolute digital certainty. The screen didn't flicker with doubt, it screamed with a 100% confidence interval. And Petrov knew something that every seasoned engineer carries in their bones. Perfect systems do not exist. In the Soviet Union of the 1980s, the official state ideology demanded faith in the infallibility of Soviet technology. To suggest a machine could fail was to suggest the state could fail. But Petrov had spent his life in the guts of these machines. He had seen the soldering joints fail. He had seen the software loops freeze. He had seen the way a single speck of dust or a surge in voltage could turn a masterpiece of engineering into a pile of junk. To Petrov, the very fact that the system was so sure was proof that it was wrong. In his mind, a real nuclear launch would be messy. It would be chaotic. There would be conflicting data, sensor noise, and a flurry of cross-confirmations. A clean, 5-missile, perfect trajectory on a brand-new experimental satellite was too tidy to be true. He understood a fundamental truth of the modern age. When a machine claims it is 100% right, when the algorithm leaves no room for error, that is precisely when you should worry the most. He didn't save the world because he was a dreamer. He saved it because he was a skeptic who knew that reality is never as neat as a line of code. In a rational world, Stanislav Petrov would have been met with a parade in Red Square. He would have been awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union. He had, quite literally, preserved the existence of the Russian people and the rest of the planet. But the Soviet Union was not a rational world. It was a world of rigid hierarchies and fragile egos. Petrov was not rewarded. Instead, he was subjected to months of grueling interrogation by the military's internal affairs and the KGB. They didn't care that he had prevented a nuclear winter. They cared that he had embarrassed the designers of the OKO system, men with high ranks and powerful friends. He was officially reprimanded, not for his decision, but for improper paperwork. They cited him for failing to log every detail of the incident in the heat of the moment, a bureaucratic technicality used to mask their true grievance. Petrov had dared to doubt the system. He had proven that the billion-ruble shield of the motherland was flawed. The incident was immediately buried under a top-secret classification. The Soviet High Command couldn't afford to let the world, or their own people, know how close they had come to total annihilation by accident. To admit Petrov was right was to admit that the Soviet Union's launch on warning doctrine was a suicide pact triggered by a sunset. Quietly, Petrov was pushed aside. He was denied promotions. His health began to fail under the stress, and he eventually retired to a life of near poverty in a drab concrete high-rise. He lived out his days in obscurity, heating his tea on a small stove, while the world he saved went on with its business, entirely unaware of his name. The story of Stanislav Petrov is often lost in the shadow of the great treaties signed by Reagan and Gorbachev, or the dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall. But the Cold War didn't end at a summit or on a battlefield. It ended in the 30 seconds of silence when a tired man in a bunker chose to trust his own soul over a computer. Stanislav Petrov didn't stop a nuclear war with heroics. He didn't fly a jet or disable a bomb. He stopped it with the most powerful tool in the human arsenal: doubt. In an age where we are increasingly told to trust the data, Petrov's legacy is a haunting reminder of the necessity of the human element. He possessed the skepticism to question the absolute truth of a screen, the human judgment to understand context, and the immense moral courage to say, "The machine is wrong." The Cold War wasn't saved by the strength of missiles or the brilliance of generals. It was saved by one man who sat in the dark, surrounded by the machinery of death, and decided that common sense was more valuable than protocol. He trusted his understanding of human behavior, knowing that an American strike would be a flood, not a trickle, more than he trusted the blinking red lights of a multi-million-dollar defense array. Because of that decision, the sun rose on September 27, 1983. Families woke up and ate breakfast. Children went to school. The gears of the world continued to turn, oblivious to the fact that the previous night the history of humanity had nearly reached its final page. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, largely uncelebrated in his own country. But every breath taken by every human being on Earth today is, in some small way, a gift from a man who had the courage to look at the end of the world and simply refuse to believe it.